Bible prophecy is very different from other prophecies like those from Nostradamus, who was a French astrologer, and he wrote a collection of 942 poetic quatrains in 1555. Now, a quatrain is a poem consisting of 4 lines, and these quatrains allegedly predict future events. And people have come along and they've used what's called retroactive clairvoyance to understand Nostradamus' prophecies. Retroactive clairvoyance is an effect of hindsight bias, whereby one retrodicts alleged predictions or prophecies. That is, after an event has occurred, one claims that a psychic had predicted it, albeit in languages or signs too vague or obscure to have been understood prior to the event in question. Well, the prophecies found in the Bible are not like that. They are detailed, specific, and interwoven with one another. I would like to point out that we are not focusing on Russia purely because of current events, because they seem to fit in with the Bible. In fact, the words we will say tonight have been said by the Christadelphians for over 150 years, long before Russia was even a world power. There's a man called John Thomas. He was a Bible student of the 19th century, and he wrote a book called Elpis Israel in 1848, and he details some of these Bible prophecies. He was led to say these words in the opening preface. The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. The Russian autocracy in its plenitude or its abundance, and on the verge of its dissolution or its demise, is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing upon the mountains of Israel, ready to be smitten by the stone. When Russia makes its grand move, the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things at present constituted is at hand. So we are not using retroactive clairvoyance. The prophecies in the Bible that we will look at tonight are detailed, they are specific, and most importantly, they are very true. So here's a brief overview of what we will look at tonight. Firstly, we'll look at Russia's current activities, specifically those involving Ukraine. Then we will look at Russia's future plans as outlined in Ezekiel 38. After that, we will look at Russia's end, also mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 38 and chapter 39. Then finally, we will look at God's future plans with the earth. So Russia's current activities. Well, December 3rd, 2021 saw a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia planning massive military offensive against Ukraine involving 175,000 troops, US intelligence warns. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said, "We don't know whether President Putin has made the decision to invade. We do know that he is putting in place the capacity to do so on short notice should he decide that's what he wants." December 17, Vladimir Putin detailed security demands to the West. Russia has put forward a highly contentious list of security guarantees it says it wants the West to agree to in order to lower tensions in Europe and defuse the crisis over Ukraine. The demands include a ban on Ukraine entering NATO and a limit to the deployment of troops and weapons to NATO's eastern flank. Russia has also demanded that NATO rule out further expansion. February 21st, Putin signs decrees on recognizing Donetsk and Luhansk republics. Putin explained in a televised address, "I believe it is necessary to take this long overdue decision. I immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic." He then sent his troops into these two areas to perform peacekeeping functions. US President Joe Biden said that Russia's decision to order troops into parts of eastern Ukraine is the beginning of a Russian invasion. So in response to Russian activity, sanctions are placed upon Russia, targeting banks, military exports, and oil refineries. And then on the 24th of February, Russia did the unthinkable and invaded a neighbouring sovereign nation. that is Putin, decided to conduct a special military operation. Its goal is to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to abuse and genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. For this, we will start the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine and will bring to justice those who committed multiple crimes against civilians, including citizens of the Russian Federation. And Putin has warned the rest of the world to not get involved. He said that any attempt to do so will lead to consequences you have never seen before. Clearly, he is talking about the use of nuclear weapons. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has not gone as he would have hoped. One of President Vladimir Putin's closest allies says that Russia's military operation in Ukraine has not gone all as quickly as the Kremlin had wanted. This is the strongest acknowledgement yet from Moscow that its invasion has not gone to plan. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed its military shortcomings, according to retired US Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. One of the key issues so far has been a lack of planning around logistics and supply systems. Military observers have pointed to the 64-kilometre-long military convoy that stalled near Ukraine's capital Kiev on March 3rd. And Russia's ground forces have become bogged down outside Kharkiv in the first week of the war. So Ukraine has resisted Russia far better than Putin had anticipated. Therefore, Putin has resorted to bombing public places. An airstrike ripped through a maternity and children's hospital in the southeastern city of Mariupol, which has been under siege by Russian forces. City officials said at least 17 people were injured in the attack, including children, women, and doctors. At least 5 people have died since the attack. A residential building in northern Kiev's Obolon area was hit by Russian strikes, killing at least 1 person and wounding 12 others. Also, on the 16th of March, Russian troops bombed a theatre where women and children had been sheltering, and satellite images showed the theatre had the word children marked out on the ground in front of it and behind it before it was blown up. Mariupol has suffered the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the war, with hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in basements, with no food, water, or power for weeks. Russian forces have blocked aid convoys from reaching the city. So what are Putin's ambitions? Well, the Canadian National Post says that President Vladimir Putin has lamented the collapse of the Soviet Union 3 decades ago as the demise of what he called historical Russia, and said the economic crisis that followed was so bad that he was forced to moonlight as a taxi driver. Putin said that Russia turned into a completely different country, and what had been built up over 1,000 years was largely lost. 25 million Russian people, he says, in newly independent countries suddenly found themselves cut off from Russia. He called it a major humanitarian tragedy. And so Putin is looking to rebuild historical Russia. But not just historical Russia, but the historical Christian Russian Empire, as can be seen in an ABC article that was given out today. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is not just a war of politics, it is a holy war. Vladimir Putin cannot separate Ukraine from the Holy Rus, the God-given Russian Empire. And also on the 3rd of March, the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko stood in front of a map which indicated invasion plans for Moldova along with Ukraine. So clearly Ukraine is not the end goal for Russia. Putin is seeking to rebuild historical Russia, and we can see that he is using brute force to accomplish his desire. But is building historical Russia the end of Russia's plans? Well, the Bible reveals that there is more to it than just the rebuilding of historical Russia. So let's have a look at Russia's future plans as outlined in Ezekiel 38. Now, Ezekiel chapter 38 is a prophecy, and it is split into two halves. The first half of the chapter goes from verse 1 to 17, and I've titled it Invasion by Gog. Have a look at verse 15 and 16 to see why I've given it this title. You, that is Gog, will come from your place out of the far north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army. You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. So this tells us that Gog will invade Israel in the latter days. The second half of this chapter goes from verse 18 through to verse 23, and I've titled this Intervention by God. And this section is about God's judgments poured out on Gog. I, that is God, will rain down on him, Gog, on his troops and on the many people who are with him. So let's focus on the first half of this chapter, the invasion by Gog. This prophecy is clearly against Gog. Verse 2 says, Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So it's very clear to see that Gog is an individual. From the use of the word him, he is a prince, and he comes from the land of Magog. Now it's important to note that Gog is not his name, it is his title. Gog means the roof, to be at the top, hence someone in control. Therefore, he is called Gog. Now, Gog comes from the land of Magog, which is the area of modern-day southwest Russia, including Ukraine. A historian called Flavius Josephus wrote in his historical book called Antiquities of the Jews that Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but who by the Greeks were called Scythians. The Scythians occupied the territory above the Black Sea. Professor Alexander Perron says in chapter 1 of the Pechenegs, under the heading of the Scythia of Herodotus, that its western side was the lower Danube, the Black Sea formed its southern boundary, while the River Don demarked its eastern side. So here's a map. The Black Sea is the bottom border of the Scythian territory, and I've circled the Don and the Danube rivers, marking its eastern and western borders. So let's put that on a bigger map. So here we have Israel in gold, the territory which is being invaded. And here is Magog. So we followed the Don and the Danube rivers, marking the east and the western borders. But we are also told that Gog is the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Well, where is Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal? Well, Rosh is Russia. It is credible that from Rosh and Meshech, that is the Rossi and the Moschi, of whom Ezekiel speaks, descended the Russians and the Muscovites, nations of the greatest celebrity in European Scythia. Ros is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of the name Russia. Ezekiel 38 verse 2 speaks of a northern nation, mentioned with Tubal and Meshech. Undoubtedly, they are the Russians, who are mentioned by Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name of Rus, dwelling to the north of Taurus, and described by Ibn Faslan, an Arabic writer of the same age, as dwelling on the river Ra, or the river Volga. So here you can see the river Volga, and it is very clearly in Russia. It begins in Russia and goes down to the Caspian Sea. So let's add Rosh to our map. There it is, right next to Magog. Well, what about Meshech? Well, Meshech is the ancient name for modern-day Moscow. In nearly every instance, they, that is Meshech, are coupled with Tubal or the Tiberini as neighbours. They are without doubt the same with the Moschi, a barbarous people of Asia, inhabiting what were known as the Moskian Mountains, between the Black and Caspian Seas. They became known as the Muskovs and gave their name to the Russian people and its capital, Moscow. Moscow is both the capital of Russia and the region that surrounds the city. To this day, one section of the Meskera lowland still carries the biblical name of Meshech. So there is Meshech on our map. Tubal. Well, Tubal is the city of Tobolsk in Russia. Terry Pewitt, an American pastor, says that Tiglath-Pileser I, the king of Assyria in about 1100 BC, refers to the descendants of Tubal as the Tabali. Josephus records their names as Tobalites, who were later known as Ibeers. Their territory was called by the Romans Iberia and covers what is now the former Soviet state of Georgia, whose capital to this day bears the name of Tubal as Tbilisi. From here, having crossed the Caucasus Mountains, this people migrated due northeast, giving their tribal name to the river of Tobol, and hence to the famous city of Tobolsk. So let's add Tubal to our map. There it is. So Rosh is Russia, Meshech is modern-day Moscow, and Tubal is Tobolsk in Siberia. Now it's also interesting to note in verse 15 of Ezekiel 38, where it says that Gog will come out of his place out of the far north, or as it says in the American Standard Version, out of the uttermost parts of the north. And it's interesting looking at a map and seeing what the uttermost parts of the north in comparison to Israel is. So you can see from this map that nearly directly north from Israel is Moscow, and there's nothing more north than Moscow. And so Russia will come out of its place of the uttermost parts of the north and will attack Israel. But they won't do it alone. There are other nations who join them in invading Israel. We will call these the Confederate Nations. Who are these nations? Well, verse 5 and 6 tells us who these nations are. We have Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops, and many people are with you. And all these countries have allied themselves with Russia. And did you notice how they're all prepared for war? With their shields, their helmets, their troops. They are completely prepared for war for when Russia says it is time to invade Israel. Now, you may be wondering how these countries will ally themselves with Russia, because currently Russia has isolated itself from the rest of the world, and many countries are unhappy with Russia's actions. However, the means of these alliances are not determined in this prophecy. Now, we don't know whether they will occur through invasion or through political diplomacy, but we believe that they most certainly will happen. So let's try to put these new countries on the map. Persia is roughly the area of modern-day Iran. You can see on the slide a side-by-side comparison of the ancient Persian Empire and modern-day Iran. You have the Caspian Sea as a reference there. And they are roughly the same size, with Persia being just a little bit bigger than modern-day Iran. John Orfrey, a Bible commentator on Ezekiel, writes that Persia extends east into southern Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. And in fact, Iran was called Persia up until 1935. So there it is on our map. And one news article said that Iran threatens to annihilate Israel, as Hezbollah boasts of reach of rockets. So they are very hostile towards Israel. And Iran predicted that they would annihilate Israel within 25 years. So that is before the year 2043. So it won't be overly hard for Russia to make Iran join them. All they need to do is promise that together they will destroy Israel. So what about Ethiopia and Libya? Well, these two countries still exist in the modern-day world, and they are roughly in the same area. Here is a map of the ancient world according to Herodotus. You can see Ethiopia there to the south of Egypt, and Libya is to the west of Egypt along the coast of North Africa. So here they are on the map. Well, what about Gomer? Well, Flavius Josephus says in his Antiquities of the Jews that Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call Galatians or Gauls, but were then called Gomerites. Well, where is modern-day Gaul? Well, Encyclopaedia Britannica says that Gaul, the region inhabited by the ancient Gaul, comprising modern-day France and parts of Belgium, western Germany and northern Italy. And so again, we will put this new country on our map. Now finally, our last of these confederate nations is Togarmah. We can see from verse 6 of Ezekiel 38 that Togarmah is to the north of Israel, and directly above Israel is Turkey. The Jews say that by Togarmah, or the house of Togarmah, we are to understand the Turks. Togarmah, therefore, as it is given in the Septuagint, has been thought by many to mean Turkoman, or the Turkoman hordes from whom the Turks have sprung. So now we have all the countries who are allied with Russia. And all these countries come against the mountains of Israel. Well, why? Verse 12 gives us the answer. To take plunder and to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited, and against a people gathered from the nations. So plunder and booty are the reason for this invasion. Now, Mark Twain wrote in 1869 in his book, Innocents Abroad, how Israel was desolate, a barren wasteland. Well, compare that with modern-day Israel. Israel has a technologically advanced market economy with cut diamonds, high technology equipment, and pharmaceuticals among its major exports. Israel has discovered the Leviathan natural gas field in 2010. Leviathan was discovered 130 kilometers west of the Mediterranean port city, Haifa, in 2010. It is estimated to hold 535 billion cubic meters of natural gas, along with 34.1 million barrels of condensate. And because of this war between Russia and Ukraine, Europe and other countries who are currently relying on Russia for gas are now looking for alternative gas imports. In fact, the US has banned imports of Russian oil, liquefied gas, and coal. Now, the CEO of Chevron, one of the largest energy companies in the world, says that natural gas pipeline from Israel to Europe could help alleviate a shortage of gas. Now, this will certainly infuriate Mr. Putin. He will no longer have power over Europe and other countries who rely on Russia for their gas. So this could be a deciding factor as to why Russia wants to invade Israel, so that Russia can once again be in control of providing energy to the world. Israel to increase natural gas exports to Egypt through Jordan pipeline. A tweet from Bloomberg.com suggests that gas exports will increase by 50% by the end of the month. Well, why? Well, the article goes on to say that the added fuel would help Egypt meet its domestic energy needs and push forward plans to consolidate regional resources for bigger markets, such as Europe. So the gas will go from Israel to Egypt and from Egypt to Europe, and anywhere else that it needs to go. Now, why is it interesting that Egypt is being involved in transporting this gas? Well, you may have noticed that Egypt is not mentioned in Ezekiel 38. That's why I've put it in grey on the map. But Egypt is found in another Bible prophecy, which is interwoven with Ezekiel 38. This prophecy is found in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, provides us with the detail of Russia invading Egypt as well as Israel, in particular, saying that Egypt shall not escape, and he, that is Russia, shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. This is clearly detailing economic reasons for Russia's invasion. Sadly, time does not allow us to look at Daniel 11 in any more detail. But there are more countries which are mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 38. Have a look at verse 13. Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take a plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take a great plunder? Well, who are all these nations? Well, Sheba and Dedan. Bible scholars say that Sheba and Dedan point to the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula. This is backed up by Gesenius, who says that Sheba is a nation and region of Arabia. He also says about Dedan that Dedan is the proper name of a people with a country of the like name, to be sought on the shore of the Persian Gulf. So let's add them to the map. So here we have Dedan in the area of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, while Sheba is in the area of Yemen. Now these two countries are seen as being favourable towards Israel, and we can see this playing out before our eyes. On September 15th, 2020, the US, the UAE and Bahrain signed the historic Abraham Accords. With this accomplishment, the UAE and Bahrain charted a new course in the history of Arab-Israeli relations by recognising the state of Israel and normalising diplomatic relations. We, the undersigned, recognise the importance of maintaining and strengthening peace in the Middle East and around the world, based on mutual understanding and coexistence, as well as respect for human dignity and freedom, including religious freedom. We pursue a vision of peace, security and prosperity in the Middle East and around the world. And Israel and the US are looking to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords. The coming year provides a golden opportunity for Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords. And Saudi Arabia has said that they see Israel as a potential ally. Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler said this: we, that is Saudi Arabia, don't look at Israel as an enemy. We look to them as a potential ally with many interests that we can pursue together. So here we can see Sheba and Dedan begin to ally themselves with Israel, which is exactly what we expect to happen based off of our knowledge of Ezekiel 38. Now mentioned with Sheba and Dedan is the merchants of Tarshish. Now Tarshish is mentioned several times in the Bible. Here is a table showing the biblical references to Tarshish. From these we can see that Tarshish is an island power. It's a naval power. It is located to the far west of Israel. It is a merchant power. It is a source of tin. It's mentioned with the young lions, and it is allied with Israel. So what island power to the west of Israel matches all of these attributes? Well, the answer is Great Britain. How do we know? Well, firstly, the UK is an island to the west of Israel. Here you can see on this map the route that merchants of Tarshish would have had to have taken. They would come from and go to Israel from directly west. Therefore, in Israel's eyes, Tarshish was to the west. Tarshish is also known as a source of tin, and tin ingots have been recovered from a shipwreck in Israel, and they have been discovered to have an unlikely origin: Cornwall in southwest England. Now this may not seem interesting, but it is when you realise that tin was quite a rare commodity in the ancient world. Now Tarshish is also mentioned with the young lions. Britain has always been referred to as the Old Lion, Here are some posters from World War I that show Britain as the old lion calling out for help from the young lions. You can see some of the countries written on the lion's bibs: Canada, India, Australia, South Africa. And so the lions, these young lions, we suggest, are the Commonwealth countries, while Tarshish, the old lion, is Great Britain. So there are all the countries mentioned in Ezekiel 38. Now remember that Egypt is not mentioned in Ezekiel 38, but it is mentioned in Daniel 11. Now what do these countries do? Well, we've seen Gog and the Confederate nations decide to come against Israel and invade. But what about these countries which are in blue? Well, we can see from verse 13 that they question Russia's motives. They say, "Have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take a great plunder?" And so when is all of this going to happen? Well, we are given some clues here in Ezekiel 38 and verse 8. It says, "After many days you will be visited. In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely." So it is in the latter years, or the time of the end, i.e. the time right before the return of Jesus Christ. But there is another clue. It says, "You'll come into the land of those brought back from the sword, brought out of the nations." Now this is referring to the Jews coming back into their land, the land of Israel, coming back in 1948. Now in AD 70, the general Titus besieged and conquered the city of Jerusalem. Here you can see a picture of the battle. Josephus says that more than 1 million perished in all of Judea. Nearly 100,000 were taken captive. And since AD 70, the Jews have been scattered throughout all the world and have gone through many sufferings, and were at times banned from entering the land of Israel, their homeland, on pain of death. But the nation of Israel has since returned after around 1900 years of being scattered throughout the world, and they declared their independence as a state in 1948. There are now around 6.7 million Jews living in Israel, and there are more coming. Jews from Ukraine are being urged to immigrate to Israel. And so this attack by Russia was prophesied to happen after the Jews' return to Israel. So let's have a look now at Russia's end. It is in the last days Russia and his allies have come down, and they are upon the mountains of Israel. Have a look at verse 18 and verse 21 of Ezekiel 38 to see God's intervention of this invasion. "And it will come to pass at the same time when Gog comes against the land of Israel, says the Lord God, that my fury will show in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath I have spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. I will call for a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains, says the Lord God. Every man's sword will be against his brother, and I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many people who are with him." So God will come against Russia, and the military power of Russia and his allies will be destroyed. Well, it all sounds quite grim, doesn't it? Is this all that will happen? The death and destruction? Well, no. The Bible also contains a hope involving a kingdom of peace. And the Christadelphians believe that Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God, will return to the earth to set up God's kingdom on the earth. We understand this from the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6, verse 10, which reads, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." But what will this kingdom be like? Well, let's have a look at Isaiah chapter 2 to answer that question. Verse 2. It shall come to pass in the latter days, so this is the same time period as Ezekiel 38, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. So the same mountains where Russian troops are destroyed is the same mountain where the house of God is established. And there is a sense of peace about these verses. All the nations have joined together for a common cause, and that cause is to learn about God and to walk in God's ways. As verse 3 says, "Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his path." Continuing with verse 4, "He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks." Now, it's ironic that Russia donated a statue of a man beating his sword into a plowshare with the words of this very verse engraved on it. They gave it to the United Nations in 1959. And yet Russia slaughters children and mothers in maternity hospitals and theatres as we speak. Isaiah 2 goes on to say, "Nation shall not lift sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." What an incredible image that is. Seeing the world unified in peace. There are no weapons, there is no war, and you can be there if you so choose. Mark 16 verse 16 says that whosoever believes and is baptized shall be saved, but whoever shall not believe shall be condemned. Now sadly we don't have time to look at this idea of baptism, but you can talk to any of the Christadelphians about it, or you can watch previous addresses on this topic, which can be found on the Enfield Christadelphian website. So what have we learnt tonight? Let's summarise. Well, we've seen Russia's current activities and ambitions. We've seen how Putin will not stop with Ukraine, but he is looking to rebuild historical Russia. We have seen Russia's future plans, how when he is allied with the Confederate nations, they will turn upon Israel and upon Egypt. But God will deliver his people Israel, and he will destroy those who seek Israel's demise. And then there will be a time of peace and serenity under the rule of Almighty God. And so we invite you, friends, to take up the Bible's hope, so that you, along with us, can enjoy God's promised kingdom in the very near future.